The church political. William Howard Taft was the largest man ever to serve as president, the only man ever to serve both as president and as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and of some interest to us, the last Unitarian president. In 1912, he was running for a second term against Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, and against a third-party effort from his former political mentor, now turned adversary, Theodore Roosevelt. John Haynes Holmes was a very progressive Unitarian minister, a radical pacifist, who later helped found the Community Church of New York, the NAACP, and the ACLU. Taft was in New York City the Sunday before Election Day in 1912, and his advisors thought it would be a good idea if he showed up in church. So picture the scene in John Haynes Holmes' church that Sunday when in comes the sitting president of the United States and his entourage to listen to Holmes deliver a sermon which urged his listeners to vote for Roosevelt. It wouldn't happen today. Among other things, for a minister to endorse a candidate in a political campaign would risk the church's tax-exempt status. Here's what the Internal Revenue Service says. All Section 501c3 organizations, including churches and religious organizations, are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elective public office. Fairly clear, right? The IRS, if it hasn't sunk in with those words, IRS goes on to give examples. If a minister signs an endorsement of a candidate in an individual capacity, that's okay, even if the minister is publicly identified as the minister of a particular church. But if the minister preaches a sermon in support of a candidate, that's a no-no. And if the minister endorses a candidate in the church newsletter, that's a no-no, even if the minister is offered to pay personally the cost of distribution of the newsletter. This current campaign is my fourth presidential election I've been through as a parish minister. And I've always maintained that the IRS is not the guide I choose as to what I can and cannot say. If I felt a religious reason to endorse a candidate, I would do so. There are conservative Christians who are challenging the IRS restrictions constantly on grounds of religious freedom. The IRS basically ignores them. It's not the fear of the IRS, and it's just not that I just don't have the guts of a John Haynes Holmes. What restrains me from partisan politics is a sense of the integrity of the church as an institution, its mission in the world, and the American tradition of separation of church and state. That's what I want to talk about this morning. We don't endorse candidates on an election as a church, and the minister doesn't do it from the pulpit, and yet at the same time, I think we have a duty as UUs to witness to our religious values in the public square. If liberals do not assert their religious values loudly and coherently, the only religious values which will resound in the public square are those of more conservative faiths. So if there were no IRS regulation, we would have still these two contradictory impulses: the duty to speak out and give voice to our values, and a duty to keep the church above the fray and not engage in partisan politics. In the tension between these two, we live and act in this election season. Before I came to Chatham, I served the Unitarian Church of Staten Island, New York, for a year. That church was founded in the 1850s. If you know your Civil War history, you may have heard of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, a unit of free blacks who fought for the Union and were massacred near Charleston, South Carolina, in a military action which was depicted in the film Glory, and which was the subject of a famous bas-relief sculpture on the Boston Common opposite the State House and UUA headquarters. The leader of the 54th Massachusetts was a young Boston man named Robert Gould Shaw. Robert Shaw's parents left Boston earlier in the 1850s and moved to Staten Island, where they were instrumental in founding of the Unitarian Church. In 1856, the Shaws also helped found a national political party dedicated to the eradication of slavery. It was called the Republican Party. I don't know whether the pulpit of the church was ever used to endorse candidates or build the party. There are hints in the official history that the Shaw family was involved in the Underground Railroad in those days. But what is clear is that the same values which led the Shaws to help found the church led them to help found the party, led their son to form a military unit and bring it down south and fight against overwhelming odds. Their truth was marching on. But the tension we feel today between the urge to political involvement and the urge to uninvolvement is not only as old as the Republic, but as old as Judaism and Christianity itself. Take the scene I read earlier, where Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and give God what is God's." The Gospel of Thomas version adds, "Give me, and give me what is mine." There are nuances which we don't have time for here between those two versions. But whether you take the Matthew version or the Thomas version, you can draw a direct line from this Jesus story to Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state. The history of this wall is fascinating, and the Lake Forest Church documented the first 30 years of culture wars in America in a little gem of a book in 2007. Remember that at the time of the American Revolution, there were established tax-supported churches throughout the original 13 colonies. In the South, these were Anglican. In New England, they were Congregational. The New England system was called the Standing Order. It was what remained of the old Puritan dream of a city on a hill, a theocracy in which good Calvinists would be able to practice their simple, austere version of religion. The Standing Order and its tax-supported ministries survived for decades after the passage of the First Amendment, which said, Congress shall pass no law respecting the establishment of religion. Well, how did that happen? Because that amendment originally applied only to the federal government. Congress shall pass no law. And the Church of the Standing Order was set up and maintained by the states. The ministers of the Standing Order, particularly in Connecticut, weighed in heavily on the election of 1800 between Jefferson and Adams. While both Jefferson and Adams might be considered small U Unitarians theologically, the denomination itself did not exist then, the Orthodox Congregational ministers could not forgive Jefferson's warm embrace of the atheistic and anti-clerical French Revolution. As the election neared, this is Forrest Church's writing, ferocious attacks filled the Federalist press. The president of Yale, Timothy Dwight, posed this question about the deist from Monticello, meaning Jefferson. Is he an infidel? Then you cannot elect him without betraying our Lord, unquote. Forrest Church goes on to trace the influence of the clergy through the administrations of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. By the end of this time, the handwriting was on the wall for the state-supported churches. And the non-established churches, like the Methodists, Presbyterians, and Universalists, were enjoying the wall of separation, for they flourished behind it. The idea of religious neutrality in the government and religious pluralism outside it had replaced the idea of theocracy and the city on the hill for most Americans. And that is the point today. Government non-involvement is good for religion. And conversely, if any one sect gains too much leverage in the halls of power, it is bad for religion across the board. That is the historical reason why we should not seek to have churches overtly involved in electoral politics. To have the government be neutral between different religious denominations, the religious denomination should be neutral between political parties. But there are other reasons beside this historical one. The great 19th century abolitionist transcendentalist preacher, Theodore Parker's most famous and controversial sermon was titled "The Transient and Permanent in Christianity." And that title reminds us that what a church should be about is the permanent, the religious truths which transcend time and place. An election may have long-term consequences, but it is also the paradigm of the transient, bound by the issues, party platform, personalities, and news events of the time. Now, I'm not saying that churches don't live within this stream of time, or that we're immune from the influence of large public events. Those of us here today are certainly shaken by the attacks on U.S. embassies, which has occurred in the wake of the anti-Mohammed video. But what we try to do as a church is to take the long view, to put the daily news headlines into a religious perspective, and to live by values which are the same day in and day out. Allied with the transitory nature of elections is the fickleness of politicians and political parties. There was a story in the Times this week about how the Obama campaign is getting contributions from fossil fuel companies, whereas in 2008, its contributions came mainly from green energy sources. This may be due to a pragmatic calculation that that's what it's going to take for the campaign to win Obama's re-election, but we as a church need not follow them down that road. If we are committed to being a consistent influence on the political scene for a sustainable future, we need to make that influence felt no matter what party is in power. As individual citizens, we will need to evaluate carefully when we go to the polls which candidate holds the most promise of governing by our values. And we may have to hold our nose and vote for someone who does not embody many of those values only because the other candidates are worse. But this situation is to be expected in the real world. Unlike some religious traditions, Unitarian Universalism for most of us does not posit any state of perfection, any Garden of Eden from which we are supposedly fallen. Peter Fleck, the founding spirit at this meeting house, published a book of essays called The Blessings of Imperfection. And that summarizes a religious vision in which the idea of perfection or perfectibility is an illusion and the needless source of much of our unhappiness. I would say the principal value which we want to witness in the world is the golden rule, found in most of the world's religion and expressed in this one as our first principle, the recognition and promotion of the inherent worth and dignity of every person. You may call it compassion, or you may simply express it negatively. We do not demonize here. We believe in freedom of speech, but we're not going to make a film mocking another's religion. But neither are we going to demonize the person that does, nor the people that react violently to it and attack embassies. We will seek to understand the motives of the disparate actors in the political drama and attempt reconciliation. In Knoxville, Tennessee, when a deranged man came in with a gun and shot up the Unitarian Church, the reaction of all those people spontaneously, half an hour after the incident, was this man must have been hurting really bad inside. There was not an outpouring of hatred. There was an outpouring of love in our finest traditions. In the last few days, something has been happening on Facebook. People have been posting pictures of themselves with signs that say they disapprove of the anti-Mohammed video and that it doesn't represent the views of most Americans or most Christians. There's been commentary about the film, of course, that sparked the riots from both presidential campaigns and from the pundits, but these photos are different. They're an attempt to use social media to go person to person. This is the kind of speech that can get around the barriers of culture and religion. It's the kind of thing that people can do in churches and that they can also do in their living rooms individually. A church founded on love does not exacerbate the divisions between people. It does not fan the flames of hate. Rather, it tries to build bridges of reconciliation. We are not trying to get at our base by inciting hostility towards other people. Another religious value restraining church involvement in electoral politics is the value of humility. Hard sometimes for Unitarians to swallow. But so much political discourse these days is strident. The truth is that no party has all the answers. Our values counsel humility and require us to listen to the political arguments on the other side to see what truths they might contain. We read from Francis David, you do not need to think alike to love alike. Francis David, if you remember your Unitarian history, was first the Catholic bishop of Transylvania. Then he converted to Lutheranism, became the Lutheran bishop of Transylvania. Then he converted to Calvinism, became the Reformed bishop of Transylvania. And then he met Unitarian, became the Unitarian bishop of Transylvania, stood outside the city gates on a rock in Coalish Bar and preached a sermon which converted the entire town to Unitarianism and converted the king as well. The only time we've ever had a Unitarian king. For that man to say, you do not need to think alike to love alike, he lived that. He lived that. And this is resulted in the Edict of Torda, which is the world's first expression of religious toleration. Then there's the value of political diversity within our congregations. Religious liberalism does not equal political liberalism. And the UU churches which contain political conservatives are stronger for it. Many UUs will strive earnestly for diversity in race, age, sexual orientation. They'd be perfectly happy if they never have to confront anyone's political opinion in church that shakes up their own worldview. If we are a covenant community and we want to walk together, we have to learn to talk across our differences and not try to convey to anyone the impression you don't belong here. In sum, the IRS is not the reason we don't endorse political candidates. We don't endorse them because of who we are as a church. But we are each free to have our own political opinions and activities outside of the church. I heard of a minister who has his candidate bumper sticker on magnets so he can remove it when he drives his car into the church. I don't do that, but I would remove a lapel pin before I walked in. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that we're completely irrelevant in the public square, or that we need to maintain a silence as to all issues. The IRS allows us to take positions on public issues, and we have unofficially done that with the school consolidation issue locally. We've taken stands on same-sex marriage, on the war in Iraq, among others. There are two measures on the ballot this November that I'm particularly concerned with. The first calls for our state legislators to send to the Congress a petition calling for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision which opened the floodgates for corporate money to influence elections. In a way, this ballot question is moot because the state legislature passed such a petition in July. So I hope we can get strong public support that we may actually move the amendment process forward in the U.S. Congress. If you need to understand more about Citizens United and its corrosive effect on democracy, there's a special issue of The Nation magazine devoted to this week. The second ballot measure in which I'm interested, in which many other UU churches are interested, is the Death with Dignity Act. This act will allow terminally ill patients to have a physician prescribe enough medication that the patient can choose the time and manner of his or her own death. It is modeled on successful statutes in Oregon and Washington. I plan to make some information available on this issue between now and Election Day, and perhaps have a debate here. Now, then I've gone and endorsed two ballot measures in a sermon. What happens to people who disagree with me, who think Citizens United is just fine, or maybe who think it is awful but a constitutional amendment would be worse? What happens to people who oppose physician-assisted suicide for the terminally ill? In this church, you are free to disagree with the minister. I may speak from the pulpit, but I do not speak ex cathedra. I'm not infallible. There is no UU orthodoxy that I am here to represent. The only religious precept that applies is that you use your reason, your heart, and your life experiences to determine how you feel about any issue, and then go vote that way. Yes, we are all political creatures, and there's nothing wrong with that. The political world is a rough and tumble one, and we can each play a part individually. We meet in the meeting house as a refuge from partisan politics. Yes, you can discuss the latest trend at your coffee hour or with your coworkers at the thrift shop. And we're not going to strip your lapel buttons, your bumper stickers, or even worse, ask you to take off your t-shirt before coming into church. But we'd like to keep the partisan speech to a minimum inside these walls for the next 7 weeks. For then, the voters will have spoken. Think about those messages of compassion from average Americans on Facebook. Many of the things worth saying, many of the things which need to be said, human to human, are best said outside the political process. Hopefully that includes what we say to one another in this place. Amen.